Hey guys, here today to do another supplemental 5 nonfiction book review for you. And while none of these have like the same theme, so it would be kind of hard to give them like these are all books on XYZ, what this did have is 5 books that absolutely in one way or another did not go the way that I expected them to go, which was really, really interesting. I, for one reason or another, thought that these books would be something they then weren't, mostly for good, but at least once not so much. So what in the world am I talking about? Well, we'll just get into it. So first of all, I want to talk about Looking for the Good War, American Amnesia and the Violent Pursuit of Happiness by Elizabeth Samet. This book was what I thought was about this woman who teaches at one of our military colleges, military institutions, you know, teaching our next leaders of our military, and she does history. And I was thinking that it was more about looking for the good war, right? And how World War II in particular is the last time the American military entered a war where you could say it was a good war. Now, obviously, we respect the sacrifices of all that served and all who lost our lives and gave their lives for our liberty. However, her point is that unlike Vietnam and the Middle Eastern wars like Iraq and Afghanistan, World War II wasn't as muddy. We were the good guys, Hitler was the bad guy, they were doing despicable things, and we were on the side of right. Now, people have very many opinions on the Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan wars. I'm not here to debate that. I'm simply saying that her thesis is that in this setup that World War II was our last good war, but of course no wars are good, and the way that we remember World War II has particularly been set up by how we've memorialized it in our culture. But there is amnesia on both fronts, because first of all, we have amnesia where it concerns how World War II was not a good war, and we also have amnesia in the way that we depict it. I think that, for example, you know, thinking about movies that have come out recently, you know, a couple of movies about Winston Churchill, a couple of movies on Midway, you know, these are all really valorizing veterans in their fight. And what Elizabeth Samet shows in this book is that we actually went through a huge period of time where, for example, our culture actually gave dark potential intentions to veterans, that these people coming back from war were very potentially dangerous, and also that war itself was dangerous. And so as our culture has shifted, the way that we've portrayed World War II has shifted. So I thought that this would be of like a cultural look at how we have memorialized World War II since, you know, it happened, its end, and up until today, which is technically what this book is. However, it does focus a lot on cinema. There is discussion of some books, some other things, but it focuses a lot on movies. And this book is very choppy in the sense that there are huge portions which are really interesting cultural analysis, and then there are huge portions which are just like a plot of a movie, a summary of a movie, like the style of a movie, such as like film noir or something, and then like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 movies sometimes in a row. And of course, these movies are Elizabeth Samet's evidence, right? So of course she's going to spend time on them to make her point. However, what that meant, especially listening to the audiobook, is that sometimes it just got really dull and sloggy, and I was like, okay, you've now talked about 5 movies that portray veterans or portray World War II in the same way. I understand your point. Can we just move on? Because like I said, the cultural analysis piece was really strong. I could not care less about the movies. I'm not a movie buff, so that might be why, but take that with a grain of salt that this was different than I expected, because it was so movie critique, movie culture focused, and not the more holistic approach to our cultural representation of World War II that I thought it would be. I still enjoyed it, but I kind of wish that I had known that going into it. Sorry, I moved because I got really excited, because it's not normal in these that I have the book like in my hand that I can hold up, but I did in fact read a physical copy of the next book I'm going to talk about, which is this, Lies My Teacher Told Me, Everything Your American History Textbook Got Wrong by James Loewen. This book is incredible. So I have talked about this a little bit, but basically my PhD studies pseudo-center around the idea of how we teach children history, specifically American history, how that history is written, the history of our history. So looking at historically the ways that we have told certain stories, because of course history, when you read a history book, it is often more indicative of the culture of the time in which it is written than the time it is trying to tell you about. So, for example, the way that we talked about slavery has changed, and the way that we talked about certain ethnic groups has changed. And when you boil that down and the way that we teach it to children, to me is eminently fascinating. So this is a book, this is, I believe, the 20th anniversary edition of this, if not more. I think it was originally published in the 90s. He did a follow-up in the early 2000s, and what James Loewen did, he is a college history professor, and he decided to analyze the major history textbooks that high school children in America were learning from. He had tried to write his own history textbook. It was rejected by several places in the South because of the way that he talked about the Civil War. And so he just wanted to see basically these other textbooks and the ones that were getting approved and how they talked about things. And also when he did his 10-year follow-up, you know, how, if in any way, the issues that he looked at had shifted. So it's interesting to see this version now, because when he first published it in 1995 and then the follow-up 10 years later or so, what was interesting was the things that shifted and the things that didn't. The book is set up so that every chapter kind of covers a different topic. And for me, as someone who I was in online school for most of my K through 12 education, I started in a Waldorf school and then went to an online school. So things like these history textbooks and the ways that history classrooms are set up in regular public schools are fairly alien to me. So on the one hand, it was really great to have him talk about the way that a history teacher normally has to go about teaching their class, and also the materials that they are teaching with. One of the reasons that I know this book has gotten a huge amount of pushback is because James Loewen's politics are on the page here. I would call Loewen left of me. And so when I'm like, wow, that's a fairly leftist point of view, you know that he has strong opinions in this book. I've talked about this before. I much prefer when people's political preferences are really on the page. It helps me to see where they're coming from and being able to analyze what they're saying more than people with like a shadow agenda pretending to be, you know, balanced when they aren't. So that is definitely a thing that comes up in this book, but I wouldn't say necessarily that, except for the chapter on labor relations, where he is very much in the Bernie Sanders mold on that one. I think more of what comes through in this book is that Loewen is just very, very passionate about the ways that we teach history, and how the way that we teach history, particularly in high school, teaches American children that their history is not important because it doesn't offer them any chance to engage with it. We just teach American history as inevitable and always good progress, which of course we know that that's not how history works. And that because we portray American history as inevitable progress, children don't feel like they have a way to impact the history of America, and so they don't even try. So it creates unengaged citizens, it creates people who don't think that their history is important to learn about, and that just comes through in every chapter where he says you don't have to agree with me politically, but you have to see through these textbooks and the ways that they are disengaging children, that no matter what your politics, we are creating children who are uninterested in being informed Americans. And, you know, especially in the climate right now, talking about, you know, alternative facts and fake news, even though he really didn't update this when it was published, he put it in a new preface that involves the beginning of the Trump administration. Obviously, he's not a fan, but his point just remains that if we want to create discerning citizens, we have to change how we teach history. I really enjoyed it. Like I said, I don't have to agree with everything, but I do agree that if this is how we're teaching our history, no wonder people really don't care about it. And that is incredibly sad. Because I care, obviously. You care if you're here, but sigh. Now for a book that was incredibly out of my comfort zone. I read Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation by Kristen Kobes-Dumez. This book was really, really popular, I think mostly last year when it came out. I had a friend who read it who's really interested in comparative religions and religion in America, and so she had read it and said that it was really good. I decided to read it because I am doing a project with a friend related to children's books and masculinity and religion. And so we thought this would be a really good place to start. And what is interesting, and I wish that I was filming this after we had talked, we haven't talked yet, because I have more of the historical background and she was raised evangelical. And so we're coming at it from those two areas of expertise. I found this book eminently readable or listenable. It flew by, which for me, it sounds like a good thing when I say it, but is not necessarily a good thing for me, because there were definitely points in this book where I was like, okay, wait a minute, slow down, explain yourself. I feel like this is a really, really great book if you are trying to understand the turn towards a stronger, particularly stronger masculine image of evangelical Christianity and Jesus. But again, because I was not raised evangelical, I don't necessarily feel like I can speak to the veracity of anything in it. It certainly sounds convincing. She has plenty of, you know, prominent evangelical leaders who she has as examples of, you know, these shifts in this particular religion denomination. And some of it's pretty weird. But again, because for me, I felt that it was going so fast and I wanted more in a couple of places, I definitely feel like if this is something that I want to continue to look at, I need something potentially a little bit more academic than this. But in terms of giving me a really broad picture really fast, I enjoyed it, and I can't wait to see where that discussion goes, where we dig a little bit deeper into it and the facets of this that I don't necessarily understand as much, see where she comes from and where I come from, and potentially bringing in things like, you know, this book really resonated with some of the things that I read in Bring the War Home, which was a discussion of white nationalist armed paramilitary groups in America, and see if we can make some cross connections there, or, you know, if she finds something in this that was completely left out. So I'm excited to be going on this reading list with her and to be engaging in this part of a group that has definitely become stronger politically as the years have gone on, but I don't really know too much about. So again, it's a quick read, it's an engaging read. I don't necessarily think there's as much as analysis as I wanted, which I think I expected there to be more of, and then there wasn't. But at this point, I expect a lot from the books that I read, so maybe the problem is me. So speaking of a book that just from the title just threw me totally for a loop, I decided to read There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century by Fiona Hill. Now, if you don't know who Fiona Hill is, but you're like, that name sounds familiar, it's because Fiona Hill was one of the people who testified in Trump's first impeachment. Now, this is a slightly autobiographical book. It does tell the story of her life, but what I was interested about it was that the blurb on Goodreads suggests that she is showing how the industrial decline of both America and Russia has created parallels that kind of show how Russia could be a really dangerous look in the near future for us if we don't fix some opportunity gaps in this country. And I thought that that was really interesting, and also with everything going on right now with Russia, I wanted to see her opinions on the political and economic situation over there, even though this was published prior to the invasion of Ukraine. And first of all, I kind of thought that this would be a negative book, so I wasn't super excited about it. The title is kind of an oxymoron. There is nothing for you here, finding opportunity. I can say that it does end on a positive note. There is actually very specific call to action items in the end, which was interesting, and I appreciated that. I did really like her memoir portion throughout this. This could have been a really kind of dense economic, social science, political science look at our economy and our history, but by weaving in her personal experience, it kept it from feeling very heavy. However, more of the parallels come from England and the US rather than the US and Russia, by which we really mean the old USSR, because Fiona Hill grew up in a coal mining town in England, and she makes a very compelling case that, you know, the coal mining towns of England and the Rust Belt towns of the United States are really experiencing incredibly similar social and economic problems, and the ways that the two governments have tried to deal with them, what has worked and what hasn't worked, and how we can take those lessons from both countries, including some from the USSR and Russia, to try to bring those parts of these countries back to life, because they really are dying. I will say in about the last fourth of the book, the memoir thread that had been really holding the book up really strongly kind of died off as it got into more of her cumulative analysis. I felt like that part went on really long, and I was like, oh Lord, it was a lot. So I'm not a super fan of that. I wish that had been done a little bit better, but at the same time, like I said, you know, this could have just been, you know, so many people are putting out just anti-Trump books or whatever, and this was really just like, I'm not a fan of everything that happened in the Trump White House for sure, but it was more about taking the long view of our socioeconomic situation right now, looking to history, looking to a more global view of countries experiencing a similar issue, and trying to build a better country for our future. So that was not at all what I expected, but I enjoyed it in the end, even if the actual end of it was a little bit ugh. And finally, coming out of absolute nowhere is Lessons from the Edge by Marie Yovanovitch. Again, if that is a name that sounds familiar and you don't know why, it just so happens that this video is two different books by people who testified in Trump's first impeachment trial. I had not planned to read Lessons from the Edge as it is billed as an actual memoir. I don't read a lot of those. I've talked about that. But I was reading reviews and hearing some people talk about it, and they were like, you know, this is an incredibly readable, interesting, globalist story, because Marie Yovanovitch, in the 30, 40 years she worked for the State Department, was in a lot of incredible places where things happened around the globe. And it served as a really nice parallel to Fiona Hill's book, because again, it is a much more global view of the United States in geopolitics than some of these books often get. Marie Yovanovitch went places like Mogadishu, she went to London, she was in Russia, she was in Ukraine before she was the Ukrainian ambassador, and she was the ambassador to Kyrgyzstan, she was our ambassador to Armenia, and then of course she finished out her career as our ambassador to Ukraine. And specifically, she was in Ukraine right before Volodymyr Zelensky got elected, And I was very interested specifically in that part to understand more of the political situation in Ukraine in the lead up to Zelensky's election. I definitely got all of that and more. Yovanovitch is really, really good at writing something that gives you the geopolitical context for where she is in that moment of time and the issues and the people and what America was trying to accomplish there, without dumping tons of, because I mean, she was in a bunch of different countries, right? And she doesn't dump information on top of you. She keeps it really quick and fast and interesting while giving you a solid foundation. This is not a memoir in the sense that it gives you a lot of useless personal details. She does talk obviously about growing up and as a child of immigrants, but once she starts her career at the State Department, she's very focused on that. And, you know, obviously it goes through what happened to her in Ukraine and the Trump impeachment shenanigans, because that really did take her out of her job, and she then retired from the State Department. And she does have an epilogue that is very like globalist and internationalist and really focused on the role America wants to play in the global world and how we can achieve our dream essentially from her point of view. It was really interesting. It was a super fast read. I didn't even want to read it, and then I was like, am I really gonna enjoy this? Like, I just kind of started it on a whim because I had the audiobook, and I'm so glad that I did, because it was just really fascinating, and also for understanding a little bit more about the conflict that Ukraine is currently engaged in and its political recent past. I'm really glad that I read it. It's really, really well written, which sometimes when political or pseudo-political figures write memoirs is not a thing, but this is really well done and I enjoyed it. All right, so that was a lot at once. So I'm gonna stop here. I got my 5 in. I will say that I am currently working on a biography of Martin Van Buren because I am trying to get back to the last 10 or so presidents I actually need to do biographies on, so maybe someday soon that will happen, but you know, I always have an audiobook on, so I'm sure one of these will be coming sooner rather than later. Thanks, guys. Bye.